The day my children took control of my life did not arrive with shouting or cruelty, but with calm voices, folded hands, and the kind of forced concern that leaves no room for disagreement. And that made it harder to fight because it was wrapped in language that sounded like care. I was 74 years old, sitting in the living room of the house I had lived in for over 3 decades. When my son Samir and my daughter Isha sat across from me on the sofa like representatives sent to negotiate my existence, their posture careful, their expressions rehearsed, and I remember noticing how neither of them asked if I wanted tea before beginning, as if small courtesies no longer applied once you were classified as a problem to solve. Samir spoke first, clearing his throat the way he does when he believes he is being reasonable. Abu, he said, we've been worried about you for some time now. Worried was the word people use when they've already decided the outcome but want to sound gentle about it. Aisha nodded in agreement, her lips pressed together, eyes filled with something that looked like concern but felt more like impatience. You live alone, she added. You don't go out much. You don't really have structure anymore. Structure. I had spent my entire life waking up before dawn, working until my bones ached, raising children who never went hungry or uneducated, building stability from scarcity, and now I was being told I lacked structure because my days were quiet. I listened without interrupting because old age teaches you that the first interruption is often used against you as proof that you are emotional, unstable, or incapable of reason. Samir continued, we think it's time we step in, make some arrangements. For your own good, there it was, the sentence that removes your consent while pretending to protect you. What arrangements? I asked calmly. He glanced at Aisha and she leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. We've been looking into assisted living options, somewhere safe, clean, with people around. You won't have to worry about managing everything anymore. Manage what exactly? I wondered, my thoughts, my routines, my freedom. And this house, Samir added quickly, it's too much for you. Too many responsibilities. We can sell it and use the money for your care. He said it so casually, like the house wasn't filled with decades of memory, with the sound of their mother's laughter, with nights spent worrying about their futures, with mornings spent praying they would grow into people who remembered where they came from. I looked around the room, the worn armchair, the bookshelf I built myself, the window where I used to stand waiting for them to come home from school, and I felt something heavy settle in my chest, not anger, but a deep, quiet disbelief. When did you decide all this? I asked. Samir shrugged slightly. We've been talking about it for a while, ever since Amy passed. Hearing my wife reduced to a justification stung more than I expected. Isha reached out and touched my arm. We're just trying to. You don't have to struggle anymore. Struggle. The word felt insulting in its innocence. Did I say I was struggling? I asked. Samir frowned. You don't have to say it. We can see it. See what I wondered? The fact that I didn't spend money recklessly, that I preferred silence to noise, that I didn't fill my days proving I was still alive. And if I don't want this? I asked quietly. Samir sighed, clearly frustrated. Abu, please don't be difficult. We're not asking, we're planning. Someone has to be practical. Practical, that word again, used like a weapon polished to look harmless. Isha avoided my eyes, which hurt more than Samir's bluntness because it told me she knew this was wrong but lacked the courage to stop it. In that moment, I understood something important. My children weren't trying to hurt me, they were trying to simplify me, and simplification is a kind of erasure that happens when people are uncomfortable with complexity, especially the complexity of aging. I nodded slowly because arguing would only confirm the story they were telling themselves about me. All right, I said, if you're planning my life, then we should talk properly. Samir relaxed immediately, mistaking my calm for surrender. Exactly, he said, that's all we want. That night, alone in my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the cupboard where I kept documents most people assumed didn't exist because I had never made a show of them. My wife and I had always believed that security didn't need an audience, and as I opened the cupboard and pulled out the familiar folders, I felt a strange mix of sadness and resolve because I had hoped I would never need these papers to defend my right to choose how I lived. There were records of properties bought quietly, investments made patiently, decisions taken with foresight rather than flair, and as I reviewed them, I realized how easily my silence had been mistaken for helplessness. The next morning, Samir brought up timelines over breakfast, already discussing facilities and logistics, and I listened until he finished, then said, before anything happens, we're having a meeting. He looked up, surprised. A meeting? Yes, I said. With a lawyer. Isha's eyes widened. Why? Because, I replied evenly, if you're taking control of my life, you should understand what you're taking it from. Samir hesitated, then shrugged. Fine, he said, if it makes you feel better. That phrase, if it makes you feel better, told me he still didn't understand, but he would. I made the call that afternoon, my voice steady as I spoke to the lawyer my wife trusted, the one who knew more about my past than my children ever had. And when he suggested a formal review, I agreed without hesitation. When I told Samir and Aisha the date, they accepted casually, confident that the meeting would confirm their assumptions. And as I watched them return to their routines, already planning a future that excluded my consent, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me because for the first time since my wife passed, I wasn't reacting to decisions made around me. I was preparing the moment when control would have to be justified. They believed they were acting out of care, but care without listening becomes control, and control without understanding becomes cruelty, even when spoken softly. And as I placed the folders back into the cupboard that night, I understood something with complete clarity. They may have taken control of my life in their minds, but one meeting, one honest confrontation with truth, was going to take it back not through anger or rebellion, but through the simple, undeniable weight of facts that no amount of concern could dismiss. The days leading up to the meeting unfolded with a strange, uneasy politeness, the kind that settles in when people believe the outcome is already decided and are simply waiting for formality to catch up. And I felt it in the way Samir spoke to me now, slower and louder, as if volume might replace understanding, and in the way Aisha hovered around me with unnecessary reminders about medicine and meals, her concern turning into supervision without her even realizing it. They had already placed me in a category, and everything I did was now interpreted through that lens. I didn't resist, because resistance would have confirmed their assumptions, and instead I watched carefully, noticing how easily control disguises itself as care when people stop listening. Samir spoke often about the assisted living facility, describing it in detail, the rooms, the staff, the schedules, as if familiarity would make surrender easier, and each time he did, I felt a quiet tightening in my chest, not fear of the place itself, but fear of how quickly my children had become comfortable planning my absence from my own home. Isha tried to soften the process, saying things like, "It'll just be a trial period, Abu, or you can always change your mind later." But the way she avoided my eyes told me she knew how rarely control is given back once it's taken. At night, alone in my room, I returned to the cupboard, spreading the folders out across the bed, organizing them not just for clarity, but for calm, reminding myself that preparation was not an act of defiance but of self-respect. There were deeds signed decades ago, bank letters written in careful language, investment summaries that told a story of patience rather than ambition. And as I read through them, I thought about how often I had chosen simplicity over explanation, believing that my children's love did not need proof, and how that belief had quietly turned into vulnerability. One evening, as I aligned the papers, Aisha stood in the doorway watching me, her face tense with emotion she hadn't yet named. "Papa," she said softly, "why didn't you ever tell us about all this?" I didn't look up. "Because I never thought I'd need to," I replied, and she swallowed hard, finally understanding that silence is not always secrecy, it's sometimes trust misplaced. Samir, on the other hand, grew impatient as the meeting approached, his confidence slipping into irritation because uncertainty is uncomfortable for people who equate control with responsibility. And one morning over breakfast, he said sharply, "Abu, you're making this into a big issue when it doesn't have to be," as if my insistence on being heard were an inconvenience rather than a right. "You're getting older," he added. "These things are inevitable." I met his gaze calmly. "Aging doesn't cancel ownership," I said, and though he scoffed, there was hesitation behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. The morning of the meeting arrived without ceremony, and that made it heavier. Samir drove us to the lawyer's office, confident but tense. Isha sat beside him, gripping her bag tightly, and I sat in the back, watching familiar streets pass by, remembering how many times I had driven them, worrying about my children's futures, never imagining they would one day try to take mine over in the name of practicality. The office itself was quiet and orderly, a place where opinions carry little weight compared to documents. And as we sat down, I noticed how Samir leaned forward instinctively, ready to direct the conversation, while Isha sat back, bracing herself. The lawyer greeted us politely and asked why we were there, and before Samir could answer, I said evenly, "We're here to review records," emphasizing the word just enough to signal that this meeting would not go the way they expected. Samir raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The lawyer opened the first folder and began methodically, explaining that before any decisions regarding relocation or asset management could be discussed, it was necessary to understand the full scope of my holdings, and I saw Samir relax slightly, clearly expecting a short review that would justify his plan. That expectation didn't last long. "This property," the lawyer said, sliding a document forward, "is registered solely under Mr. Khan's name." Samir frowned. "Which property?" he asked. The lawyer named an address Samir recognized immediately, his posture stiffening. "That's that old building near the market," he said slowly. "I thought it belonged to someone else." "It belongs to your father," the lawyer replied calmly, and Aisha's breath caught, her hand flying to her mouth as the first crack appeared in the story they had built. The lawyer continued without pause, moving from one record to the next, and with each document the version of me my children believed in began to unravel. There were accounts they didn't know existed, investments that contradicted the idea that I was unprepared, and carefully worded instructions that made it clear I had planned not just for survival but for autonomy. Samir's questions grew fewer and more cautious, his earlier confidence replaced by focused disbelief, and finally he asked, "Why wouldn't you tell us about this?" I answered calmly. "Because my life was not a report I owed you," and the lawyer paused just long enough to let the words settle into the room. When the lawyer explained that these records included explicit clauses protecting my right to decide where and how I lived, that no sale or relocation could occur without my consent, Isha's composure broke, tears spilling as the weight of what they had planned without me finally landed. "So we can't just decide," she whispered. "No," the lawyer replied gently, "you can't." Samir leaned back slowly, stunned, his voice stripped of its authority when he said, "We thought we were helping." I looked at him, then really looked at my son, and said quietly, "Help that doesn't listen becomes control." The meeting continued with clarifications, but the tone had changed completely. Samir now listened instead of leading. Aisha asked questions with care rather than certainty, and when the lawyer concluded by saying any future planning must be led by Mr. Khan himself, I felt no triumph, only relief, because being heard is not about winning, it's about existing without permission. As we walked out of the office, the silence between us was heavy but different from before, no longer dismissive but reflective. And I knew that while this meeting had forced my children to listen, it had also begun something more difficult. The slow, uncomfortable work of unlearning assumptions that had allowed them to take control of my life in the first place. And that work, I understood, would not end here. But this moment, this one meeting, had already taken something essential back. My voice spoken clearly at last and no longer possible to ignore. The silence that followed us out of the lawyer's office was heavier than anything that had been said inside it. Not because words were missing, but because too many truths had finally settled where excuses used to live. And as we walked toward the car, I noticed how Samir no longer walked ahead of me with the confidence of a man leading a plan, but slowed his pace without realizing it, matching mine, while Isha stayed close at my side, her shoulder brushing mine in a way that felt like both apology and reassurance. The drive home was quiet, but it wasn't awkward, it was reflective. The kind of quiet where people replay moments in their heads, examining where they went wrong, and I watched their faces in the reflection of the windshield, seeing confusion, regret, and something else beginning to form, respect. When we reached the house, Samir didn't turn off the engine immediately, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if letting go would force him to accept something he wasn't ready to name. And finally he exhaled and said, "I really thought I was doing the right thing." His voice lower than usual, stripped of authority, and I answered gently, "You were trying to solve a problem that didn't exist," because I wanted him to understand without feeling attacked. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted in ways that were subtle but undeniable. Conversations that once happened over my head now paused until I entered the room. Plans were no longer announced as conclusions but floated as questions. And though the change felt awkward, like learning a new rhythm after years of marching to the wrong beat, it also felt necessary, like something settling back into its proper place. Isha followed me into my room that evening, sitting on the edge of the bed the way she used to when she was young, her eyes swollen from holding back tears she no longer had the energy to hide. "Papa," she whispered, "I didn't realize how much we were taking from you." I looked at her, at my daughter who had always been sensitive but often silent when it mattered, and I said, "Control doesn't feel like control when it's wrapped in concern." And she nodded, finally understanding why her good intentions had hurt. Samir struggled more openly. Over the next few days, he hovered around me with an awkward politeness, offering help I didn't need, opening doors I had opened myself for decades. And though the gestures were clumsy, I recognized them as effort, the first steps of someone relearning how to show care without taking over. One afternoon, he sat across from me in the living room and said, "I thought if I didn't step in, something bad would happen." And for the first time, I heard fear instead of certainty in his voice. "Fear doesn't justify control," I replied calmly. "It just explains it." He nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction like a lesson he hadn't known he needed. The days passed, and with them came conversations we had avoided for years. Conversations about aging, about independence, about how children sometimes cope with the idea of losing a parent by trying to manage them before they're gone. And I listened without judgment, because understanding their fear didn't mean excusing their actions, but it did make room for healing. Samir admitted one night that seeing me live so quietly scared him, that he equated simplicity with decline, and that planning my future had been his way of convincing himself he still had control over time itself. And I told him honestly, you can't manage loss by managing people. And he sat with that truth in silence, letting it settle. Isha, meanwhile, began asking questions about my past she had never thought to ask. How I made decisions when money was tight, why I chose restraint over display, how her mother and I planned without ever making it look like planning. And one afternoon, as we went through old photographs together, she stopped at a picture of me standing proudly beside a modest home I'd built decades ago and said, "I thought you lived simply because you had no choice," and I smiled softly. "I lived simply because it gave me peace," I replied, and I saw understanding dawn in her eyes, not dramatic but deep. Another follow-up meeting with the lawyer was scheduled, not because of conflict, but because clarity creates questions, and this time the difference was unmistakable. Samir sat back and listened. Aisha took notes quietly, and when the lawyer asked who would be making final decisions moving forward, Samir looked at me instead of answering, a small gesture that carried enormous weight, because it signaled that control had been returned where it belonged. Walking out of that meeting, I felt lighter than I had in months, not because everything was resolved, but because the direction had changed, and direction matters more than speed when trust is being rebuilt. At home, my children began adjusting their expectations in ways that went beyond words. They stopped framing my independence as risk, stopped interpreting my routines as warning signs, and I realized how powerful narratives are. Once they stopped seeing me as fragile, they stopped treating me that way. One evening, while watching my grandchildren play, Samir sat beside me and said quietly, "I didn't think about how humiliating it must have felt." And I replied, "Most humiliation comes from assumptions, not intent." And he nodded, finally understanding that harm doesn't require malice to be real. The meeting had taken control back, yes, but what followed was more important. It had forced my children to confront how easily love can slip into dominance when fear goes unexamined. And as days turned into weeks, I noticed how often Samir now asked, "What do you think?" And how Isha waited for my answer without rushing to fill the silence. And I knew then that while one meeting had changed the structure of my life, it was these everyday moments of listening that were truly giving it back to me piece by piece, restoring not just my authority, but my place intact and undeniable within the family I had built. The real test of whether control had truly been returned did not come immediately after the lawyer's office or in the careful apologies that followed, but in the quiet, ordinary days where habits either change or quietly return. And I watched those days closely because dignity is not restored in speeches but in routine. Samir tried hard, I could see that, but effort does not always equal understanding, and there were moments when his old instincts surfaced, when he would catch himself halfway through giving instructions and stop abruptly, swallowing his words like someone learning a new language they were afraid to mispronounce. Isha adjusted differently, less visibly but more deeply, stepping back where she once hovered, letting silence exist without rushing to fill it. And that restraint told me she had finally grasped how suffocating constant concern can feel when it replaces trust. One afternoon, Samir suggested reviewing my weekly schedule just to see if anything could be improved, and I felt the old irritation rise, sharp and familiar. But before I could respond, he stopped himself and said, "Only if you want to," and that pause, small, almost invisible, meant more to me than any apology because it showed awareness where entitlement once lived. We talked then properly about boundaries, about how care becomes control when permission is assumed instead of asked for. And for the first time, Samir didn't argue or defend himself. He listened, nodding slowly as if rearranging something fundamental in his thinking. Another meeting with the lawyer was scheduled weeks later, not out of conflict but to formalize the autonomy that had been acknowledged, and this time the tone was entirely different. Samir sat back, hands folded, waiting rather than directing. Isha asked thoughtful questions without steering the answers, and when the lawyer turned to me and asked how I wished to proceed with future planning, the room felt balanced, no longer tilted against me. I spoke calmly about what I wanted, not isolation, not supervision, but independence supported by respect. And as I spoke, I realized how long I had been editing myself to avoid discomfort, and how freeing it felt to speak without fearing dismissal. After that meeting, we sat together at a small cafe nearby, something we hadn't done in years without tension, and the conversation drifted naturally, touching on memories, shared laughter, and even moments of regret that no one rushed to justify or excuse, and I felt a warmth settle in my chest, not because everything was resolved, but because honesty had finally replaced assumption. Samir admitted then, his voice quiet and unguarded, that watching me age frightened him, that he mistook simplicity for decline because it made him feel time slipping out of his control. And I told him gently that trying to manage another person's life is a poor substitute for accepting uncertainty, and he nodded, absorbing the truth without resistance. In the weeks that followed, my children began to treat my routines not as warning signs but as preferences, my quiet not as absence but as presence expressed differently, and that shift changed the entire atmosphere of the house. I no longer felt watched, evaluated, or prepared for relocation, and that freedom restored something vital in me that I hadn't realized was eroding my ease. Even my grandchildren sensed the difference, gravitating toward me with the same natural comfort they had when they were younger, asking questions, sitting beside me, unburdened by the adult fears that had complicated things, and watching them reminded me that authority rooted in calm is instinctively recognized. One evening, standing on the balcony with Samir, the city lights spread out below us, he said quietly, "I didn't realize how easily love can turn into control," and I replied, "It happens when fear is louder than trust," and he stood there a long time afterward thinking. As days passed, I found myself returning to my own rhythms with a sense of ownership I hadn't felt since before my wife passed, taking walks without explanation, spending afternoons reading without feeling idle, making plans without having to justify them, and I realized how profoundly control, even when well-intentioned, shrinks a person's sense of self. The meeting had taken control back in a formal sense, yes, but what truly reclaimed my life was the daily practice of being consulted instead of managed, of being respected instead of monitored, and I understood then that dignity, once restored, must be protected not by documents but by continued awareness. Watching my children relearn how to be my children rather than my supervisors was not always easy, but it was honest. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, is what allows relationships to mature rather than harden. As weeks turned into months, the future they once planned for me without asking faded quietly, replaced by one shaped through conversation, patience, and mutual respect. And I stood one morning at the window, sunlight warming my face, knowing that while aging is inevitable, erasure is not, and that one meeting had not only taken control of my life back, but had taught all of us a lesson we would carry forward, that love, to remain love, must always leave room for the person it claims to protect. The real ending did not arrive with raised voices, final signatures, or dramatic confrontations. but in the slow, almost invisible return of something I hadn't realized was slipping away until it was gone, the quiet certainty that my life still belonged to me. And I felt it one early morning when I woke before sunrise, the house silent, and noticed that my first thought was no longer about what explanations I might owe that day, but simply about what I wanted to do with the hours ahead. I sat at the small table near the window with a cup of tea, watching the street gradually come alive. And for the first time in months, there was no tightness in my chest, no sense of being observed or evaluated, just the steady rhythm of a day unfolding on my terms. Samir joined me a little later, rubbing his eyes, and instead of reminding me about appointments or suggesting adjustments to my routine, he asked, almost casually, "What are you planning today?" The question itself felt like a quiet apology because it assumed I still had plans worth asking about. "I'll go for a walk," I said, "maybe visit an old friend." He nodded without hesitation. "Let me know if you want company," he said, not insisting, not hovering, and when I declined, he smiled and said, "All right," and that single exchange told me more than all the meetings combined. Isha, too, had changed in ways that felt deeper than words. She no longer checked in out of anxiety, but out of connection, sitting with me in the evenings, listening rather than correcting, and one night she admitted softly, "I think I was afraid that if I didn't manage your future, there wouldn't be one." And I told her gently that futures don't disappear just because they're quiet. They only disappear when people stop believing they belong to someone. The assisted living brochures vanished from the dining table without announcement, folded away and forgotten, and the house itself seemed to exhale, conversations flowing more naturally now that no one was bracing for disagreement. I noticed how my grandchildren responded to the shift instinctively, climbing into my lap again, asking endless questions, sensing the return of an authority that was calm rather than imposed, and it struck me how deeply children recognize dignity even when adults struggle to name it. One afternoon, while helping one of them with homework, Samir stood in the doorway watching quietly, and he said under his breath, "I forgot how steady you are." And I felt something warm settle in my chest, not pride, but relief, because steadiness is what I had always offered, even when it went unnoticed. The records that had forced them to listen were filed away again, no longer weapons or shields, just documents resting where they belonged, their purpose fulfilled. And I realized that I no longer needed them to speak for me because my children were finally listening to my voice without requiring proof. A final conversation came unexpectedly one evening on the balcony, the city lights flickering below us, when Samir said quietly, "I think I took control because I didn't know how to sit with uncertainty," and I nodded, understanding more than he knew. "Uncertainty doesn't need solutions," I said, "it needs patience." He stood there for a long time after that, absorbing the truth, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was lighter. "I'm glad you made us listen," he said. "Even if it was uncomfortable," I smiled faintly. "Listening usually is," I replied. As weeks passed, the shape of my life settled into something steady and deeply satisfying, not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. I continued living simply, not as a statement or a sacrifice, but as a choice, and now my children understood the difference, no longer mistaking restraint for weakness or quiet for decline. I returned to my routines with renewed ease, taking walks without explanation, spending afternoons reading without feeling idle, making plans without needing approval, and I realized how much energy I had spent before justifying my existence, energy that was now free to be used simply on living. One night, alone in my room, I opened the cupboard where the records were kept, looked at the neatly stacked folders, and closed it again, not because I was finished with the past, but because I no longer needed it to defend my future. The truth had already done its work. Lying in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of a home that once again felt fully mine, I thought about how close I had come to being gently displaced, not through cruelty, but through love tangled with fear, and how important it is sometimes to draw a line before dignity erodes beyond recognition. My children had taken control of my life believing they were acting out of care, but one meeting, one moment of clarity, had taken it back, not by humiliating them or elevating me, but by restoring balance, reminding us all that care without listening becomes control, and control without consent becomes erasure. In the end, what mattered most was not that my children learned what I owned or how prepared I was, but that they remembered who I was, a man still capable of choosing, still deserving of agency, still present in his own life. And as sleep finally claimed me that night, I felt a deep, settled peace, knowing that my future was no longer being planned in another room, but unfolding quietly, deliberately, and unmistakably under my own hand, exactly where it belonged.